students and others will continue to join us, so that's okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this semester's World Affairs lecture. Just so everyone knows, the event is being recorded. As Professor Chaudhry said, it will be cataloged in the Gladys Marcus Library here at FIT. This event, like was mentioned, has been planned for a long time, and it's a collaboration among many different, not only people, but also departments across the college. So we have lots of people to thank before we get started. The School of Liberal Arts, Dean Patrick Knisely, thank you so much for your support of the program. And we really want to especially thank Mary Sujimoto from the Office of the Dean of Liberal Arts. It's not always easy to figure out the paperwork for these events, and Mary has really gone above and beyond to make this happen. So thank you. Also, this is a collaboration between the Office of International Programs, the Presidential Scholars Program, the Social Sciences Department, Professor Paul Clement, the chair of the department. Thank you so much. And from the behind the scenes team, although they are in front of the scene today, they're not always. So Professors Emre, Ozsoz and Praveen Chaudhry are here. Thank you so much. I just want to give a tiny introduction to the World Affairs lecture. This is our opportunity to bring to FIT, it used to be in person, now it's virtually, issues of the day from around the world. And who knew that the pandemic would actually help broaden our reach and be able to bring to us, speakers from parts of the world who would not be able to come from the 12 to 1:30 slot that we have together here on a Thursday afternoon. Also, we try to focus on issues of importance and significance, not just in the world, but to our students especially. So in this Women's History Month, it is just a perfect moment to talk about one of the many gendered spaces around us and the gendered space of journalism in particular. But if anyone either, on this call or people that who you may talk about the World Affairs lecture with, have ideas of other topics and especially other speakers, please do reach out to us because, we have our areas of interest and expertise, so we are always happy to entertain other ideas as well. So, you see all our names here, so feel free to email us at our FIT emails with that. But before further going on more, I want to turn the floor over to my colleague, Professor Souzeina Mushtaq, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media Studies at the University of Wisconsin River Falls. I have learned so much from working with Souzeina over the years, so I'm sure she will lead a wonderful Q&A and she will introduce our speaker as well. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Professor Levine, for the introduction. And I'm grateful to the organizers of the World Affairs Lecture Series here at the State University of New York Fashion Institute of Technology for inviting me again to host this event. Our speaker today needs no introduction, and yet here I am introducing her. She's a journalist, storyteller, first female editor of a major news magazine in India. She has written for the BBC News, Al Jazeera, The Open Magazine, India Today magazine, among others. She got her master's from Syracuse University and lived in Utica, also known as the town that loves refugees, in upstate New York, where she wrote about refugees and their lives in exile. In 2008, our speaker moved to India and worked for a national newspaper where she wrote about culture and society. She then went on a fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania to research the state of primary education in India. And today she continues to explore lives of others and write about the mundane. Growing up, she read a lot of literature and was curious about everything. And it reflects in her writing. Even as an editor, she continues to report. And as someone who has been following her work for over a decade now, I can tell you, storytelling is at the heart of her reporting. And to quote the speaker herself, I was taught that everybody has a story to tell, if only you would listen to them and write honestly and with conviction and without judgments. Welcome, Chinki Sinha. It's my pleasure to have this conversation with you. How are you?
Thank you so much for that. Thank you.
How are you doing?
I'm okay, tired. I was traveling all day.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Okay, so Chinki, like you and I, we have been talking about it, and this is something that Professor Levine also brought, in her introduction, that journalism is sort of a gendered space, right? And women mostly get typecast in fashion. And we have seen many female editors, albeit brilliant female editors of fashion magazines. So how does it feel to be the first female editor of a national news magazine?
Hectic, very hectic. But on a serious note, it's a very gendered space in India, and the story. We have the right wing, government. We have a right wing attitude. Very difficult to be a woman and to kind of edit a political magazine. It's not just and yeah, and invite the trolls. So it's been it's I've just been there for 6 months. This is my 6th month, and it's difficult. It's not easy. When I first joined uh, Outlook magazine, which has been around for 26 years and has always had male editors, just like any other news magazine in India, or rather newspapers as well. It was difficult because they had never had quote unquote a younger woman. I'm not saying young. I'm not young, but and they'd never had a woman. So we had mass resignations. We had everybody resigned. The team was no longer there. There was a lot of resistance, not just from men but also from women, who I also thought were kind of towing the patriarchy thing. Were not used to a woman, and they would talk to me. I mean, people would talk very differently. I mean, I've been a journalist all my life, and newsroom conversations were totally very different here. People would call me and say, like reporters would call me and say that, why do you have uh, such hatred against men? And things like that. It was very difficult. It was amusing, but it was also challenging. So to look at all this kind of attitude, but the thing was, there was work to be done, and I came from a very different sensibility. Like, I was a literature student. I had covered arts, and I had covered different kinds of stories. And I came from a reporting background. I mean, very few editors come from that background. And I've always been a field reporter. I was never a political reporter in that sense. And so we started doing what needed to be done, and we figured a way that if we wanted to say things that were politically um, you know that were political, we needed to figure a way how to say them. And so we started this collaboration with arts and artists and illustrators and all kinds of people. And we did not uh, go only with the big artists, although we had few, but we also went with all kinds of artists, and we went with story ideas that were people centric. And we took that approach from kind of like going to people and then talking about things, rather than just interviewing political leaders, because that's not I mean, in my career I never did it, and I never understood it. So we wanted to make it simple, and we wanted to make it engaging. I think the biggest problem I see is lack of empathy, and I thought, once people have empathy, I think they will be able to understand people more, and that whole othering business will stop. I mean, you would know it better because you are also from India, and you know how the situation situation is. Yeah.
Right. No, I absolutely agree with you. And you definitely raised a lot of issues, and we'll try to discuss some of those issues in our conversation today. But first, want to start with this idea when you said that how difficult it is to be an editor of a political magazine, because of patriarchy, right? Because journalism, like so many other professions in the world, is still male dominated. And feminism is still misunderstood in many cultures, like as a man-hating thing. And Outlook
Yeah.
magazine, now that you are the editor, the first female editor of that magazine, has been accused of being a quote unquote feminist magazine,
Yes.
as if it's a bad thing, And as you
Yes.
mentioned, and it's been difficult, as you said, right? So how do you respond to those quote unquote accusations of it being a feminist magazine?
Okay, so I'll tell you a little story. When I first went to that magazine office, and I had like no clue, but I was just looking at the magazine and I saw these two pages, and they used to be called Glitterati, and this was all about like Bollywood stars and Hollywood stars and everything. And there was this one actress they had put, and they had said Mauni Ray perfectly proportioned or something like with the perfect proportions. And then there was Drew Barrymore, and then they had said 46 but still lovely. So I circled it and I said, we need to dump these pages. And that was the first day. And they were like, oh, but it's just lighthearted. See, this is the difference how men see it and how women see it. And for me, that was I think that was the bigger fight as to how to kind of figure let these things go from the magazine, because they had been there, and they had these views. So yeah, so we dropped those pages, and then we started the second issue that we did was that in the colleges and other educational institutions, there were a lot of these writers being banned, like there was this play called Drupadi by Mahashweta Devi, a feminist writer, and that had been taken off the syllabus. And we thought, okay, let's do it, and let's take the risk. And how we do it was the most interesting thing, actually. And we got her niece to write about her, and we got a lot of people. So we wanted to get that perspective, and then people started saying that, why do you always have a woman centric or a woman perspective included? So I said, but you have to, because when we're talking even about politics and the caste and religion, you also have women as caste bank, which was proven in Bihar when Nitish Kumar created that separate kind of vote bank. And women are voters, and I think it's high time that we started to look at that rather than just as caste and religion and this whole male viewpoint. So we started doing that, and then we had that one issue that we discussed was Shah Rukh Khan, and his son had been jailed, and there were obvious reasons why he was being intimidated, and we decided to go with a cover on him. And firstly, that itself was a big thing, and secondly, we only got women to write, because Shah Rukh Khan actually in the 90s, when we had the liberalization and globalization come into India, he became the poster child of that. And a lot of us grew with Shah Rukh Khan, and we understood love in a very different way. Love was before very macho, and you had these like really macho male figures who would come on screen, and they were fighters. And here you have a guy who's vulnerable, who doesn't look like an ordinary hero. He's not that good looking, and he's human. And so we did that. I mean, there were other examples I can talk about, but you can ask more. But these were
No, that's
we were labeled as that, actually. And then I just say that it's not a bad thing to be a feminist, and all of you guys should be, actually. I mean, there's no harm.
right. No, absolutely. You mentioned Shah Rukh Khan's cover, and I want to share the cover with our audiences here. I don't know if you can all see this. Um, this was a very fascinating issue because Shah Rukh Khan is not only, he's not only the biggest and the most popular star in India, but also all around the world. But recently, we have also seen Shah Rukh Khan becoming a soft target for online hate because, quote unquote, for his Muslim identity. And as people might know, that at the cremation of the singer Lata Mangeshkar, when Shah Rukh Khan raised his hands to, read a prayer and then he blew in the air, he was trolled for allegedly spitting on the mortal remains of the legendary singer. And for those of you who do not know, blowing into the air after offering the dua or the prayer is an Islamic ritual done to ensure that the prayers reach the person. And the other example that Chinki just mentioned was when Shah Rukh Khan's son Aryan Khan was arrested, and then he was accused of allegedly carrying drugs on a cruise ship. And trolls again started slamming the actor and calling him a bad father or bad influence for kids. And also, a few years ago, Shah Rukh Khan had made a passing statement about the then political situation in India. And then people also labeled him as intolerant. So, and Chinki, as you mentioned in your issue, you only chose women to, write about Shah Rukh Khan. So, could you talk more about why did you choose Shah Rukh Khan for this issue?
Okay, see, that's a funny story because what happened was that this whole thing was going on, and and I like Shah Rukh Khan. I mean, I'm a '90s person, and my this friend of mine is a World Bank economist, and she had been working on a book on Shah Rukh Khan for the last like 10 years or so, and her book had just gotten done. And I was just taking a little like power nap kind of a thing, and I saw Shah Rukh Khan, and I went to the meeting and I said, okay, we have Shah Rukh Khan on the cover, and everybody's looking at me as if I said something totally like wrong. And they're like, why? It's risky, because you'll be targeted and all. I said, no, I don't know. I mean, my intuition says we take Shah Rukh Khan. So we went, and things worked out in the sense that I spoke to this writer, Shayana, and we had a long conversation that night. And she talked to me about her research and how she had gone to do a survey, and she got talking to women, and they talked about Shah Rukh Khan and his vulnerabilities. And in India, where you have so much patriarchy, that you have domestic violence, all kinds of issues, they secretly dreamed of somebody like Shah Rukh Khan. That romance was still there, and he showed that romance. Obviously, he's played problematic characters as well, but in the 90s, things started to change in India, right? You had 1990, you had one film release where you had an actress who was dusky, and Anu Agarwal, if you remember, Ashiki had come, and from there on, the brand started coming in, and Shah Rukh Khan was this huge, like a hurricane. He hit us, and so we started like exploring this whole thing. And then I spoke to this Pakistani artist Rashid Rana, because he had, and if you look at the cover, the image itself is very political. I mean, he talks about borders, and he talks about hero worshipping across borders. And this is a 2004 series where it's called Omatidia, which means the insect eye, and it's composed of this mosaic of photographs of men in Lahore on the streets, actually. So basically, he's looking at, the Shah Rukh Khan, actually, the whole of Shah Rukh Khan image is composed of these thousands and thousands of men in Lahore. And then we related it to Bell Hooks, the feminist author. And we talked about oppositional gaze, and we kind of, wanted to talk about that also, because how Shah Rukh Khan is looking at you and we are looking at Shah Rukh Khan, somebody we loved, and in this environment. So the cover itself became a different story altogether. And we did, I mean, that was also the thing, that how can you take a Pakistani artist, on the cover, right when Shah Rukh Khan has been, told by, Hindutva trolls to go to Pakistan and all of that, and you keep having that in India. And we said, okay, let's just go ahead with it. I mean, we'll see what happens. And so we got a lot of women who were serious women, academics, and they were researchers, and they were film critics, not the usual kinds of film critics. And they all talked about Shah Rukh Khan as a person who, what he stood for, actually, the idea of it, which was secular, which was vulnerability, which was, so all of that kind of, we wanted to use this issue to remind people of what they had forgotten and where we are headed, and it's not okay. Yeah. So I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And that makes sense. And you're right. I mean, Shah Rukh Khan was like, in the 90s, he came like as this, he basically challenged what it meant to be a masculine person, this idea of romance. Like, he's still known as the most romantic actor in Bollywood, right? I mean, ask people anywhere in the world, and the first thing they will tell you when you ask them about Bollywood is Shah Rukh Khan, right? So this, I mean,
Yeah.
I absolutely agree with you. So kind of continuing with that conversation, you call yourself a curator of absences, and I think we have a little bit idea, but I want you to talk more about what exactly are these absences that you're curating or you're trying to curate, so our audiences have a better understanding.
Well, when I was a journalist and when I came to India, I would get excited by everything. I think I was just like one of those people. And, whenever I would pitch these ideas, they would all be dismissed and rejected. And I didn't understand why they were being rejected, because apparently there was like, they thought that there was no audience for those kinds of stories. These were about peripheral people, things that kind of, like, let's say street walkers, like prostitutes or stuff like that. It was not the in your face politics. And so, I made a dress, and on that dress I embroidered this Curator of Absences, because that became my life biggest complaint, that I'm just curating these absent stories, and nobody is willing to take those stories. And well, out of 10, maybe I managed to do 3 or 4, but the 6 stories remained, and those were my absences. The absent that I still have that dress. And so when I became the editor, I thought maybe this is the time to kind of uh, curate those stories now and try. Yeah.
Abs- Absolutely. And I remember you wrote a piece where you mentioned that when you were young and you were on your way to school, you saw a eunuch, a hijra, and she lifted her skirt, and there was this quote unquote absence. And you write like a void, right? And you were not shocked, but you knew better not to ask about this at home. But
Yeah.
as a person who you were, like as a curious person, you wanted to know more about that void and what it meant to live with one. And then you and I, we have been talking, on and off. And you mentioned that in the fall of 2005, you met a trans woman named Frances in New York, and that changed your life. And since then, you
Yeah.
have been writing about these absences, about these complexities of identities, right? About fringe communities and their lives. And you recently went back to Kamantipura, a red light district in Mumbai, whose story you have been following for a while. And I want to share a cover with our audiences here. Um, and you specifically wrote about Zenith. You have been writing about her a lot, who profoundly told you, and I quote, castration at best rids you of the burden of maleness. But
Yeah.
you write in your story that Kamantipura is changing. Sex trade has dwindled over the years and is now confined to a few lanes because real estate developer, they have brought properties, and that has caused displacement of many sex workers. And recently, filmmaker Sanjalila Bhansali released his film, Gangubai Kathiawadi. And that has been so far positively received by the audiences. So, could you tell us a little bit more about the issue and how you have been writing about these fringe issues, about these people who are normally absent in mainstream discourses?
Well, so I landed in Kamathipura a decade ago. I mean, before that, I would like to talk about a little bit about Francis, who I met in snowy Syracuse. I still call it snowy Syracuse. And we had this assignment in journalism school to to profile somebody, and I had no idea. I came from here, and I was looking at this Syracuse Post Standard, and I came across this little ad, and it said that somebody had sued in New York State for bathroom or something. And I didn't understand this whole debate at that time, because in India you were the Hijra community is different, and you don't get to know much about it. And I was still very young then, and you don't get to ask questions. I was obviously curious, but never asked those questions. So I just looked up these yellow pages or whatever, and then I found her number, and she picked up, and she agreed to meet me in the mall. And I met her, and I remember the first meeting. I just asked her, and I was very intimidated by her because I didn't understand. I mean, I didn't know better. And she said that try wearing the wrong shoe in your right feet. And so I went home and I tried the shoes, like in the other feet kind of deal, and it was difficult. And she's like, that's what it means to be this person. And she was a Catholic priest who underwent sexual reassignment surgery at the age of 52. And after that we developed so my thing about journalism is also that you develop friendships, otherwise you're not able to report on people. It's very difficult. So that's where literature comes in, and fiction comes in, and poetry comes in, and all those kinds of things. And so I became friends with Frances, and I still remember I had taken a lehenga also from India for her once. And they used to have these parties, these parties where cross dressers would come and dress up and whatever. So from there, I always remembered her and I kept writing about her. My final thesis was also about her. And she kind of changed my life in terms of gender and identity. And as a woman, I also thought it kind of intersected because we also have this identity thing in a different way and we keep questioning as to who we are and how are we placed in the society. And so I went to Kamatipura for a different story and I landed in this red light area in gully number 1, which was the Hijra gully, which means the gully of transgenders. And I met this person called Zenith. And Zenith, the first night I met her, she was wearing this black sari, and I've talked about that a lot. And it was her birthday, and it was very intimidating because there was this, 8 eunuchs, and there was me, and there was a photographer who, and we left that day. But I don't know why I went. I kept going back, and I kept going back, and it was difficult in the beginning because they wouldn't understand why I'm coming, and I didn't even know why I was going. And I would just take a flight from Delhi and kind of go. And you know uh, I think I was also going through a bad phase in my life at the time. And they kind of heard me out, and they did not judge, they did not know anything in that sense. And I figured that this is a good exchange of stories, because no matter where I wrote, even if I wrote in the Time magazine, their life would have remained unaffected. I mean, we think of ourselves as like bringing in some change never comes like that. So yeah, so then from that time onwards, I started to notice that Kamatipura was changing, in the sense that Zenith kept talking about this building where they were and how the builders are coming in, and she couldn't decide whether to sell or not to sell, and stuff like that. And the whole Hijra Gully basically got uprooted right in front of me. And that Zenith's house is the first one that had come up and the last one to go. And these big builders had come in. There's a lot of this politics, there's a lot of money, capitalism, all kinds of stuff involved. But nobody bothered to ask these poor sex workers where they would go, because this is a livelihood question as well. And there's a lot of stigma, of course. I mean, there's this unspoken rule that even if you get rehabilitated in Kamatipura itself, you will not be able to do sex work. And it's a mixed area, it's a very complicated area. So we decided to go back because Sanjay Leela Bhansali, big filmmaker in India, decided to come out with this story on Gangubai, who used to be a sex worker in Kamatipura in the 60s. And she passed away in 77. And her story is fascinating because she worked a lot with she worked to kind of like send these kids to school. Kids were not getting admission at the time, and she kind of like made it a rule that nobody forces people into this sex work. But not much was known about Gangubai, except that there was a statue in one of the buildings that she lived in. uh, there's this journalist duo like Hussein Zaidi and Jane Borges, who had written about her, but it's just a small chapter in a book. Leela Bhansali took it upon himself to create the surreal world of Kamatipura. And I have been going there for 10 years, and also I've looked at Mary Ellen Mark's work and other works that have documented that place. Uh, so we decided to kind of do an issue looking at sex workers and their lives, and in particular, taking that old thing in journalism where you follow a particular person and you tell the story through that person. So I told it through this one particular brothel that I kept going to for the last 10 years, and what happens to them and where will they go. And I remember Zenith had told me the first meeting, she's like, they call these high rises towers, and she said that when the towers come up, remember us. And I haven't seen her in many years. I mean, she was not there when I went, but so that was the story.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating story, and I really loved it. And I have always told you how much I love your writing style, and I loved how you ended the story with you telling Kay that please tell Zina that I still remember her. So that was a very beautiful way to end that story. At this point, I would like to remind our audiences, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, while Chinki and I will continue having our conversation. And towards the end of our conversation, we will open the question answers session to the audience. So meanwhile, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. So Chinki, coming back to your role as an editor at Outlook. And as you mentioned, in the beginning, you talked about the design and the cover, and we have seen some interesting cover art and designs, and in our conversations, you pointed out that design is political, right? Personal is political. And I wanted to talk to you about some of your iconic covers. And the first one is altered federalism. And I want to share the cover with our audiences here so they know what I'm talking about. So this cover image is of a wall of your artist friend's studio in Goa, right? And the frames and
Yeah.
the altars and all these other miniatures are from the film sets that you worked on and off from other places. And there's also an image of Indian Constitution at the bottom here. And you
Yes.
decided to use this image and explore the concept of, in this context of elections in India. And as we know that India's right-wing ruling party, BJP, won the elections in the country's most populous state, Uttar Pradesh, making it the first party since 1989 to win 2 consecutive terms in that state. And this win is significant because the current chief minister of Uttar Pradesh, Yogi Adityanath, is a well-known Hindu supremacist who constantly uses provocative rhetoric against Muslims. In fact, in his 2019 speech, he said that Muslim vote was a quote unquote green virus trying to take over the country. In February 2022, he used a derogatory word when referring to Muslim men in an interview with a local television channel. In 2020, in UP, they introduced a controversial anti-conversion bill, which actually makes it harder for interfaith couples to marry or for people to convert to Islam or Christianity. And during his tenure, some cities named after historic Muslim figures have had their names changed to reflect India's quote unquote Hindu history. And not only that, many Muslims have also been mercilessly beaten and sometimes even lynched to death. And experts like Gregory Stanton, who founded the Genocide Watch Group, actually has warned of impending genocide of Muslims in India. So Chinki, this was also your first election as an editor. So what do you think is the state of federalism in India?
Well, we see. I also studied political science, and I'll go by what I studied. They said India has federalism, and over the years, I've had a lot of these discussions. And you know how some political reporters who are men, they always think that they can mansplain to you constitution and other things, and clearly your reading of the constitution really doesn't matter to them. So this idea actually came from a conversation, and we were having this WhatsApp group conversation, and this guy kept saying this, the political person, that firstly India's secular thing is not based on the French model. And there's this new term secular, by the way, and by all means I won according to them. But and he said that this is about embracing all religion. I said no, religion is not there in the state, because this is what I read the constitution, and this is clearly separation of this church, whatever, state and religion. It's not about loving all religion. Religion is not there. And then the whole thing of federalism. And over the years, because we have such a strong central government, uh, and we have a lot of these states who have voted for BJP. There have been talks about the weakening of India's federalist structure, and we have a mix of the UK and the US constitutions, right? So we have a federal thing, because a lot of these states were brought into the fold of India and were promised certain things, like for example Jammu and Kashmir, the entire northeast, Hyderabad side, Goa, for instance, and some of these hilly areas in Chhattisgarh. And I mean, you name it, and you have certain provisions. And the beauty of all of this was, this coalition politics also. And I come from Bihar, where coalition model was actually. You know Precedes the India's model, where you had this coalition experiment done in the 60s and 70s, and then in the 90s you see India moving towards coalition politics, where a lot of these parties come together to form the government. And to me, I thought that was that's important. When you have a very strong central government, it's difficult, because you have a lot of diversity in India. I mean, people look different, people talk different. There's this language thing about Hindi being this colonizing kind of a language. They keep talking about one language, one country. And there was this professor I was talking to, and he said it's not about unity, it's about togetherness, and that's what we lack. And so we decided to do this cover on federalism, again a very kind of like dangerous subject to touch upon in the current times. But and I was in Goa in January, and the cover is interesting because I just took this photo for another story, and I was sitting in office, and I'm like, oh, that photo can be the cover, and Aradhana Seth, who's a set designer, it was her house, and if you look at this wall in her living room, it's got all these things from different sets. Like there's this altar from Born Supremacy, and she designed the sets for that in Goa. And there's all this other stuff from different places. If you see, there's Buddha, there's a Muharram thing. You see. These things from all over the place. You see these old handmade or whatever posters of Indian gods and goddesses, which reminds me of another book called Gods in the Bazaar. And then you have this Nehru, Jinnah, and all these people again on the top, and then you have the constitution, and the constitution is at the bottom, and you have this money thing which we use in our weddings, and all this garland made of currency notes, and you can see it right there, which to me symbolized money and crony capitalism, which is actually also a big danger to our this thing. And so we decided to go with this cover. And then in this issue, we talked about federalism, and how federalism actually has changed over the whole concept has changed over the years. And we looked at the bigger ideas in these elections rather than talking about what's going on, because as a magazine, I don't think that's our job. Our job is to bring back into focus certain conversations that people are not willing to have. uh, so I hope that answered the question.
No, that's right, and you're right, and I think you continue doing that with other covers that you came up with. In fact, there is one particular cover that I want to share with the audiences, and I want to talk to you more about that. But let me share the screen first. The act of protest, right? So while the country is simmering with hate, there's also hope because people are not silent, right? They're protesting, and as you write in one of your issues, and I quote, resistance remains civil society's most potent weapon against injustice and subjugation. So, be it the year long farmers' protest against the government's introduction of laws making farmers more vulnerable to big companies, by loosening rules around sale, pricing, and storage of farm produce, or Shaheen Bagh protest against Citizenship Amendment Act, which makes faith the basis for acquiring Indian nationality, and the act has been dubbed as anti-Muslim. So your magazine covered the issue, and this is the cover that people can see on their screens, Act of Protest, to look at the art of protest over the years and how they have shaped India. So Chinki, what did you find?
Well, this was actually quite fun. Firstly, because it was the first anniversary of the farmers' protest, and I had covered it as a reporter. I'd gone to it every day almost, and journalists got arrested and stuff like. And we had to walk. There was tear gas. There was like all kinds of stuff. Like there were these barricades that the police had built, and you saw like these long cement blocks, and you had to go through garbage and whatever to reach the site of the protest. It was very different, this to be at a protest. And I have always gone to protest for as long as I think I know myself. I mean, in the US also, I think I was at the Occupy the Hood, and all kinds of Occupy El Barrio also, I think I must have attended. There's something about this protest, I keep going. And so I went to cover this protest. And earlier I had covered this Shaheen Bagh protest in Aligarh, which was also a site of a lot of violence. I mean, women had been beaten up. Women were sitting in the cold, wrapped in cellophane paper, because the the authorities wouldn't let them even do a tent, and this was like freezing cold. I think it was in December, January, when temperatures just dipped. And it was I have spent nights at the protest, and it was I mean, I went there as a journalist, but it was very different experience for me. I learned a lot about resistance movements and how you sustain resistance, horizontal, vertical, all kinds of movements. And I have always been fascinated by these horizontal kind of protests, where you don't have leadership in that sense. And farmers protest was very interesting for me to understand the ecosystem firstly of the protest. Like, how do you manage a protest like this? How do you cook? How do you get food? What do you do for sanitation? And these are like thousands and thousands of farmers all around the border, of Delhi. And so I used to keep telling my friends to go and witness this, because something very interesting. So anyways, the year long protest, and a lot of farmers died, during the protest. I mean, the farmers even took out a newspaper, by the way, called Trolley Times, because they did not trust the traditional mainstream media, which was which is very polarized in India right now. And because magazines are considered dinosaurs, I mean, we really don't have, like, everybody wants to be on TV, and we are not a TV thing. So anyway, so they took out this magazine, a newspaper called Trolley Times, to report on their own things. And I had read about this story of a woman, very old woman, who actually was doing some crochet in her village, and suddenly she heard on the loudspeaker that people are going to the protest, and tractors would come in, and very well organized protest. And she said that I have to be there, and she came, and she died in the cold. And for me, like, I remember all these stories, right? And because I was there. And finally the Modi government gave in, and they said that they would repeal the three farm laws that the farmers had been protesting on. And that's another story to explain what these laws were and all of that. And that coincided also with the first anniversary of this farmers protest, right? So we decided to do a cover, and we decided to take a stand, rather than being neutral about things, because I think in the current situation in India, protest is hope, and resistance is hope. Because if there's a situation where everybody is clamping down on you, and you still can protest. And I have seen a lot of people, we have so much fear, people are not able to say things. I thought protest is very gives you hope that you can at least raise your voice against something. And so we decided to do this cover, because we didn't want to go with a general image of a protest, like, your hands are like this or whatever, what you see general. And we had this friend, I mean, I have this artist, GR Iranna. And actually, if you look at the cover, it's not one image, there are these are two of his artworks. This wall, and this is a separate artwork, it's just a wall. And there was this other one, which was an artwork where he had shown a carpet, and the carpet had this little branch coming out. So we asked him for permission, that whether we can fuse your two artworks together. Normally artists wouldn't let you do that, because that's basically altering the entire artwork. But Irana said, okay, for protest, I'll give you the permission. So we did this, and it was a very unusual kind of a thing, but we wanted to show that even in the face of a wall, you still can have a branch come out. I mean, it's a tiny branch, it's a dry branch, it probably just has one flower, but that one thing is enough. And the reason we took that image was also because after the year, like, when the whole thing was announced, I had gone to the protest. And I went, and I saw the farmers had basically made, like, because they were staying there for a year, they had made their little gardens around their tents. And that was one of the most beautiful things I had seen, under the concrete flyover, at the border where you have highways and interstates. There were these, like, tents, and these tents were surrounded by these flowers, and they had made that place very beautiful. And when I asked them, they said that this reminds us of our village, and even if we have to die here, we'll die, but at least it will give us some, like, that whole thing of home. And then I remember that I had read, and as I said, I mean, I'm a literature student, and I had read this Rebecca Solnit's Orwell's Roses. And she talks about going to Orwell's house, and like, he had planted these roses, and somebody who wrote the kind of grim stuff that he wrote in in his books, and he had predicted this, right? Like, this kind of a dystopian society with surveillance and all of this. He still planted roses, and so we decided to kind of, if you see, the main story is about that, actually. It's, yeah.
I think that's a beautiful transition to talk about the final two covers. And I want to share the screen with the audiences. Apocalypse and Love, and not only we have been through the pandemic, and which is still going on, by the way, and I don't see any end to it, but also violence in many forms, right? As you mentioned, political, religious, and patriarchal, and also casteist. And as you mentioned, then there is still hope, right? Hope still lives. And I remember you tweeted last year, and I want to quote, that we are not meant to digest hatred. That's why we throw up. And there is so much vomit around that to walk the landscape means you have to jump, run, or even do somersaults. We will do it for the sake of free speech and for the sake of love. So, could you talk a little bit about the intersection of apocalypse and love, and what it means to you as a journalist to take a stand and not be neutral? You know, because in journalism, and I've studied journalism. I teach journalism now, and we always tell our students, you know, we have to be neutral. We have to be, for the lack of a better word, you know, objective, right? And here you're taking a stand. So, what does it mean to take a stand? And what is this intersection about apocalypse and love? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Okay, that's an interesting one. Actually, I didn't remember that quote that you just said, but but yeah, thanks
Yeah,
for
you
remembering.
tweet. I read your, yeah. That was a tweet you did when you shared Shah Rukh Khan's cover
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
on your
remember
Twitter.
now. So apocalypse is basically, when the pandemic hit us in India, and I live alone. And also another thing about which I thought I should mention about being the first woman, I mean, being the woman editor. I'm also single, which makes it even more complicated because I'm totally like this whole patriarchy. This they are not able to, like, it's very difficult to be like, firstly, if you are a woman, it's problematic enough, and if you are a woman who's single also, it's even worse. So anyway, so I was when I joined, and I used to live alone, because and I did not know how to cook properly. And when the pandemic hit us, I went through all kinds of trauma. Right, and we were wearing these PPE kits and going to graveyards and going all over. When I there was a time when I couldn't see anybody on the streets except myself. Like, actually, you could have a picnic on a flyover, it was like that. And oh, sorry, there's like some this we have a festival thing. So yeah, so and I kept seeing this image, this horse. One night I was out, and I went back to the protest sites to look at what the protest sites looked like during this pandemic. And they had just uprooted this Shaheen Bagh protest on March 23rd, if I'm not wrong. Right when Mr. Modi announced this lockdown, it was forcefully removed. And I remember that these walls had all these slogans and poetry and everything. And that night when I went, it was all gone. Like, it was all whitewashed in the matter of few hours. And for me, pandemic became that. It was kind of apocalyptic in the sense that you are just erasing every kind of everything that we were like witnessing for the last whatever time. And that night when I was coming back near that protest site, this was this concrete metro station, and there was nobody, and there was a horse, and the horse was standing under the lamplight, the street lamp. And I kept asking the driver as to why this horse is not moving, and he said that he had been abandoned and the leg was broken. And the horse wouldn't have been able to eat anything because it was all concrete. And we have this mythology, where my mother had gone, like, every time we would do something bad, my mother would say that the end of the world will come, and when the end of the world will come, there will be a blue god, a white horse. He's called the apocalyptic horse rider, and he will come and slay everybody and then establish the world again. And this is the kind of story I grew up with, and somehow the horse reminded me of that. And then I went to the cremation ground, and I first saw this god, the avatar called Kalki. And all these images during that pandemic was apocalyptic for me. So when we decided to do this anniversary issue, which is the apocalypse, we decided to go with apocalypse as a theme, but not in a negative way. Apocalypse, as I said, also could mean the re-establishment of anything. And I'm not saying it in a religious way. So we got all kinds of writers who talked about all kinds of things about apocalypse and what they'd gone through. We had poetry, we had this artwork is from a yet unmade film that a friend of mine, Vibha Galhotra, an artist, was making. And this basically has a person dressed in this hazmat suit, and she's trying to show this end of the world. And if you see, he's walking in this barren landscape, which is so dystopian and futuristic. And if you see a tiny dot, and these are the salt pans. So probably, I don't know what the end of the world will look like, but probably like this. But this was the cover, and we had 8 inside covers, which also talked about hope. And yeah, so it was. That was the anniversary issue, and this was the first one was drawn by a 7-year-old girl, a 6-year-old girl actually. She's my friend's niece, and he had sent me that photo just like that, that my niece is a Vogue kid. And I said, oh, why don't you just give it to us and we'll publish it. And so yeah, so like if kids are thinking like this, probably there was apocalypse. Second one is a photo from a mental asylum, and this friend of mine had taken this photo of this old woman, and he wrote about her thing. And he's a big fan of Ocean Vuong, and even I am. And you know and he had titled this series of work as on earth we are gorgeous, we are briefly gorgeous, something like that. So we took that image, and then after apocalypse we wanted to be disruptive. And I think as an editor or a journalist, you need to be disruptive. So after like this December issue, we wanted to start 2022 with love, because I still feel that love is going to save everyone. And I think in a country where there's so much hatred everywhere, there's so much othering, and I see it every day on my family WhatsApp group. Like everybody's talking like all kinds of nonsense. Uh, I thought let's emphasize on love. And this again is my friend Aradhana's artwork, and it was a very old thing that she had even forgotten. And I was looking for some love image, and she overheard me, and then she said, "Oh, I have something." And if you see the hearts, they're all not really, really red. They're all like shaded. And that implied a lot of other meaning. That love is not always this whole thing of this or that. I mean, love could be so many things, the possibilities of love, and the disruptive nature of love as well. And then she had done a whole series of different colors love. So we did that entire piece about the colors of love, and we had a lot of people write about everything. Yeah, I mean, we wanted to give
That's
hope actually after apocalypse.
right.
The new world order, love. Yeah.
Right. Oh, that makes sense, and I think that's the beautiful way to end the conversation here and open the session for question answers from audiences. So we have Professor Yasemin and Professor Emre. So if you have any questions in the chat, you can ask them.
Hi, Chinki. I have the first question from one of our participants. The question is, what do you think about the Muslim hijab ban that's currently happening in India?
See, I mean, again, as a journalist, but this is an opinion. I think people should be free to wear whatever they want to wear. And I think the reasons behind this kind of stuff is also to push the whole thing towards the uniform civil code. And there's a larger politics behind this. And this is, again, this matter of othering. But I feel that this whole hijab ban that is happening is not really constitutional in that sense, because we have freedom of expression. In that freedom of expression, this is there. And who are we to emancipate anyone? The constitution gives you the right to wear. I mean, if you can wear a bikini, you can wear a hijab. I mean, on that front, I'm very clear.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. So another question in the chat is from a participant that earlier in the discussion you mentioned people, mostly men, asking why you always include female perspectives in your work. And the question is whether you've crunched the numbers and tried to respond to this with data, not necessarily to the trolls because they can't really be persuaded, but more to those who may be in positions of power who are asking these types of questions.
I think we have moved in our country beyond this whole number thing. And as a journalist, I've always felt that numbers can always be manipulated. I think the bigger question here is of having empathy and to understand perspectives which may not have numbers or crunching or data. A lot of feelings don't have numbers. I mean, the cases that have not been counted and things like that. I think numbers are important, but numbers are not everything. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Especially in journalism, I think they're not everything.
Thanks, Chinki. I have another question, Chinki. This is from one of our participants again. What was your biggest challenge working in the media as a single woman?
Oh, many. And that would take like 7 days and 7 nights to talk about those. But many, you are looked upon in a certain way, and you all know about this whole Me Too thing, right? And especially when so that kind of stuff. Then you have this strange thing about women who get paid lesser. You have questions when you go for a job. People will ask you, oh, why are you not married, or why are you single? And I'm like, but that's has nothing to do with my resume. So a lot of challenges actually, and a lot of dangers as well in terms of reporting from the ground, because you go and firstly, there are no bathrooms in that sense, right, on the road, and to go into places and stuff. So being a single woman is challenging, but it's also quite fun. I mean, I'm still learning. I mean, it's just not it's not been a long time, but yeah, I mean, being a woman itself is a problem for them, and then single woman even worse.
I have a question, if I may ask one. I was really fascinated when you were talking about the protests, the farmer protests, because here finally we have an example of a mass movement by people who are disadvantaged that sort of works, right? I mean, the government drew back their plans that were being protested against. So, can you tell us a little bit more about that experience? And you said you were there as a journalist, which is, of course, different than being there as a protester. So, if you could give us a little bit more of a sense of what that was like and what being there as a journalist, I guess it offers some protections, but does it make you feel a little bit away from the heart of the protest? I'd love to hear a little bit more about that because this is very recent, right? A few months ago.
Yeah. No, so basically, farmers' protest came right after the Shaheen Bagh protest. And when that protest kind of failed, and because it was a woman-led protest, which was the first of its kind, which, led by Muslim women, and there was a lot of violence that they were responding to, and it was peaceful, we all felt involved. I mean, there's no way. Look, I don't really believe in this whole objectivity theory, because I don't think as human beings we are very objective in that sense. Like, even the choice of a story idea itself will uh, is not very objective in that sense. So we all felt involved, and in the sense, when you are reporting, you're neutral, right, in the sense that you're also highlighting what the other side says, but sometimes you don't have to be. I mean, there are clear cut cases of you've seen this whole violence on clips and everything, and verified. So I mean, really, there's no point of that. In the farmers protest, when we were there, uh, firstly, the protest was very energetic, and the first day itself, when the farmers were made to halt in Burari, we had gone there, and they were very polite. They were very civilized, and they were very polite. They refused to speak to a lot of this mainstream media, but were very polite to offer them food also, and that happened right in front of us. And this media, you have to understand, in India we have polarized media. So one media will show farmers as like kind of terrorists, where they are trying to disrupt peace and this and that, and they even laid nails on the streets so that they would stop farmers from entering Delhi, that kind of stuff. And then you have this other media which still has some kind of conscience left, which will report, and you don't even have to take their side, you just have to report. But we don't do reporting here. I mean, a lot of the media, and that's where it creates, I mean, the problem. So while we were there, I think one of the most interesting things, and I didn't feel very removed from the action, because once you were there, you were part of it, in the sense that it was all around you. And when I would come back, and even if you had like a cup of tea which somebody offered you, the right wing journalists or the right wing media will say that, oh, these journalists are going there to get food, as if I don't have food at home, that these kind of silly allegations were put. So yeah, so in terms of learning, it was a lot of learning. In terms, I mean, it's fascinating to see how a mass protest like this had been organized, and how disciplined it was in terms of there was so much provocation, there was so much violence that was there, but they never ever responded like that. And there were a lot of these conspiracies that happened, and you witnessed it, and you were there, so you knew what was happening. And there was a lot of this art and culture stuff that was happening over there. So all of it was very interesting, and sometimes you felt that, as I said in the magazine, we took a stand. We said that protests are important, so we were not really removed. We were I wouldn't say that we participated in the protest in that sense, as but we were witnesses, and being a witness in this country is also a huge deal, because a lot of people and a lot of young journalists don't even want to go to the ground. So that's that. I don't know if it answers your questions, but just to see that whole thing of continuing after you've seen like a big movement fail in the no, it didn't fail. The state, because it was, in my opinion, a Muslim thing, they could uproot it because there was this whole othering happening. Farmers protest, they couldn't, and that was a very beautiful thing to see. Yeah.
Thank you. No, that answers my question perfectly.
Chinki, I have a question. You mentioned, I mean, you said you're touching controversial issues in India. You write about farmer protests. You write about sex workers and gentrification. I'm just wondering, do you ever get any pressure from local politicians or from federal politicians not to publish any of these stories in magazine?
But I don't know. I haven't. I think they don't. Probably nobody knows me. That's why, or maybe I have no idea. We did get some pressure. You, like I was never very active on Twitter any which ways. It's just that after I took over the magazine, I started to tweet those covers, and I think a lot of people are not able to understand those covers only, so they are unable to troll me. And the only time I think I came close to a little bit of like this thing where we covered this AFSPA, which is this army rule we have in India, where in certain states which are considered uh, sensitive and whatever, you have these, uh, you know, terrorists, so as to speak, insurgency, where the army cannot be held accountable. I mean, in simplistic ways, I'm saying. And there was this in December. There was this. 14 civilians had been gunned down by the army, and they admitted to it in Nagaland, which is like the northeastern, uh, and nobody knows about Nagaland. A lot of people don't even know where Nagaland is, but it's one of the northeastern states. And I said, okay, we'll go there. And I went there, and I had no idea how to get to Nagaland. I mean, I'd never been there, and it's like backbreaking. There are no roads in Nagaland. This is the most underdeveloped kind of a place. And there we heard these testimonies, and we saw the vehicle, and we saw the vehicles. The front screen had been, the army had shot the paramilitary or whatever. That shot. It was a frontal attack. So this whole thing of in India, where they were saying that these guys were fleeing, how can you flee when it's a frontal attack? The bullets will not. So we took that photo of the windscreen of the car and basically put it on the cover. um, I don't know if Souzeina has that cover, but if you want, you guys can Google it and see it. And that time, I think we did a lot of stories from Kashmir, from Manipur, from all the states that have AFSPA, and basically their stories of injustice. And I had covered AFSPA before also in Manipur, where extrajudicial killings had taken place, and they had killed a 12-year-old boy, and in Manipur. And so we got a little bit of a thing. That you guys are doing too much of AFPA. Uh, Beyond that, I don't think. I think I've been lucky so far, but yeah, touch wood.
Thank you. Actually, as a follow-up to this question, there's actually a question from the audience, which is arrest and harassment of journalists is becoming very common in India. Are you scared? Now that you
Me?
mentioned, yeah.
No, I think I had a stalker not many years ago, few years ago, and I think my stalker trained me in a way not to be afraid. So I think I'm used to it. That was a joke. I don't know. I'm not scared. I mean, no, no.
Thank you. Souzeina, you mentioned you had a question, right?
Yes. So Chinki, you talked about the polarized media, and I mean, being a journalist and now teaching journalism, I have encountered that, both in my professional life, as a journalist, but also as an academic. That when I teach students about journalism, the first question they ask is, but there is fake news, right? And it has become such a common thing now in the US, in India, elsewhere in the world. So how do you deal with that situation? Like how can we give hope to students of journalism and to people who want to become journalists in the future that there is still hope? Is there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question, because this post-truth world is so much there that, and I can tell you, I mean, I only see most of the stuff that I understand is through stories. I had gone to Hathras 2 years ago, where a 19-year-old Dalit girl was fatally raped, so much so that her tongue was gouged out, and it was uh, very bad. Um, so I go there in this village, and firstly they were not allowing journalists, and this is UP, where you mentioned the Hindu right-wing government, and the atrocities on Dalits, which is the low caste in India, have been there, historically oppressed, and this case became big. I mean, there are so many rapes, but this case, and every case should be reported, but this case became big because there was a journalist who posted photos on social media, and this anyways, so everybody congregated, their political leaders, journalists, everyone. They wouldn't let us go. 2 days later they let us go, and I go to this village, and I'm surrounded by journalists, like from TV, from local, every all kinds of journalists, and suddenly there's this 2 3 journalists come up to me, and they're like, do you know the real story? And I'm like, no, what is the real story? And they cremated the body of the girl, by the way, at 3 a.m. in the morning, after they got her from the hospital, to erase whatever forensic evidence there would be, because the accused were upper caste men from the same village. uh, so I said, what's the story? And they were like, oh, she was having an affair. And I'm like, yeah, but that doesn't justify the rape. And so when I was there, and I went, and I got really this thing traumatized. And somebody asked me about my mental trauma. Yeah, this is the kind of mental trauma. You get angry also, because you are also a woman, right? And so then I went back the next day to kind of like quietly to. So I understood that there were all these narratives being floated, this post-truth situation where the truth is there, but it's packaged in a way that a lot of that media was reporting how the girl had this affair. Uh, Forget about what happened to her or what was the injustice. So I wrote a piece about this post-truth world of others, and I think there is hope in that sense, where you can write about things that as to what you see, what you hear. And I think that's the other kind of journalism I would kind of do practice, like, write everything. And there are to way of truth. I mean, the truth is all somewhere. It's just camouflage. Kind of, very, very truths.
I think we are having some technical issues.
Chinki, I think you are breaking. Are you still there? Can you hear us?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you not?
Yes.
Think so.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I think your voice was breaking and your video suddenly went off. So thank you for that answer. And kind of going back to, continuing with that conversation, there's a question in the chat. And Professor Yasemin, would you like to ask that question?
Sure. I mean, I think everybody is so impressed by your bravery and humor in the face of all this threats. And so, another question is, and you sort of alluded to this as well, how do you ensure your both physical safety, but also your taking care of your mental health as well? But I believe we're having some connectivity issues. We cannot hear you. No, Chinki, we cannot.
Yes, I'm getting a text from her. I think the connection, she lost the connection.
All right. But better now than at the beginning of our session. I think she can still hear us, perhaps, because
Right.
she's still on the WebEx. So
Right.
I will just say thank you so much to Chinki for taking the time to meet with us, and Professor Souzeina Mushtaq for moderating and hosting the event. Thank you so much. This was really, really interesting. And thank you everybody for coming, and please be in touch with our next World Affairs lecture. Thank you.